All right. In this particular part of the project-specific techniques demonstrations, we're going to be looking at the 3D camera in the scene. So we're going to be working on how to change to a 3D camera view, how to adjust some of its settings, and also how to use it to navigate around your scene to get a preview of what you will output when you create still images from Blender. So let's go ahead and take a look at that part. So first off, to understand where your 3D camera is inside of Blender, your Blender 3D camera is actually this little pyramid-looking shaped icon or form in your 3D scene. You can also find your camera in your outliner panel in the upper right. If you select it from there, it will highlight it inside of your scene. Now it's very simple looking. What it shows you is a couple different things. So I'm just going to zoom in on it here for a second so you can understand it. So the 3D camera has a few different signifiers on it. Number one, it has this little arrow on it, or upside down triangle. That triangle actually points to the up position on purpose to tell you which way is up for the camera as you move it around your scene. The projection cone that you're seeing, pyramid cone, that actually tells you the direction that the camera is aimed, so to speak. So the box is the same shape as the scene for the camera lens. So you can think of it as kind of like the lens for the camera. And the body would actually, for the camera, would be on the side where the point is. So you would stand back there and aim out towards your scene. That's what the camera looks like inside of Blender, generally speaking. Now, beyond that, to get a good preview of what it does, make sure you have quad view turned on. So switch back to quad view. And to activate the perspective to see from your camera, hit the 0 key on your number pad over on the far right. And when you hit the 0 key, 0 automatically converts your user view to camera perspective. And here's what it's showing you. Gives you a little crop box on screen, and that actually shows you the size of your camera viewport. So whatever's inside that little box that you see, that's what your camera is currently seeing. So you can actually zoom in and out on that if you want to get closer to what it's looking at. But that's as much as it's looking at. Now, what typically is done is that you can leave a viewport like this turned on for the camera and then move your camera in one of the other scenes to be able to manipulate its position inside the environment. There are ways to technically lock a camera onto an object so that it will always stare at like a particular element of an object. I'm not really going to go over that because that takes some setting up today. That's something we'll look at in the next or the final sort of setup exercise. But if you use your other viewports, you can actually reposition your camera and use your rotate functions to kind of adjust it, realign it, and reposition it in 3D space. Now that's just basic camera, getting it around and getting used to its movement inside the scene. Now, what makes the camera operate a little bit more effectively is actually changing its property functions inside of Blender. So let's look at the property panel for the camera tool. So over here on your property panel again, now we have a new icon for camera because we have it selected. Keep in mind, properties will always change based on the object you currently have active or selected in your scene. So I've got my camera selected. Again, it's the video camera, so it has like 2 spools on top of the camera body. So it's kind of a cinematic camera. But when I turn that on, here's some of the settings that we can adjust to change the way our camera looks at our scene. So the first thing we get to change is the lens. This is really the biggest in terms of what we're working with in Blender. You get 2 real options that I want you to focus on. The first one is perspective. That's the default setting. So perspective lens means that you get a vanishing point in the scene, you get visual distortion, so it kind of looks more natural. And sometimes that's good, sometimes it can be really hard to control when you have perspective turned on. And then the other option is orthographic. So if you click on orthographic, if you don't recall from when we were looking at our viewports early on in Blender, all of our right, front, and top views are all orthographic, so they don't have any perspective bend on them or twist or distortion. So that's what this does for the camera. It literally removes all the distortion from the lens. So what that actually means is that you can't just move your camera closer to your subject to make it zoom in and out. When it's in orthographic, orthographic does not use physical zoom movements to zoom in and out on a subject. It doesn't need to do that. So what I do is just pick the position that I want my camera to be at in my other angle ports or viewports. And then I use the property option for orthographic scale, and I just click and drag on it to zoom in and out on my scene. And what it does is that it maintains perfect perspective the whole time. Your model does not distort, it does not reshape. And that's actually really helpful a lot of the time for positioning objects or viewing your scene. So it's always kind of a flat perspective is what that tool does to your scene. So kind of interesting. But that's what you can play with, I mean, in terms of working with orthographic scale. It's very much controlled by the scaling tool inside your property panel. If you go back to the perspective camera, it is controlled by focal length, which is more like a standard lens. So it will replicate different focal lengths based on the slider. So focal lengths that are typically greater than 50 millimeters are very flattening, non-distorting millimeter ranges. You get below 50 down towards like 35, 24, 16, and so on. It gets more fisheye looking and really, really, really heavy wide-angle distortion. And those are fun to play with when you're trying to render like a realistic looking scene. But typically in Blender, when we're just working with showing off a model, the orthographic is by far the more appropriate route to go. All right. I'm not really going to go over the other details for the camera editor down below, so we can ignore the other properties for it. And just pay attention to those couple items from the lens section for your camera property. And again, as far as working with the camera, remember what you see through the camera is actually what you get to export whenever we render still images out of Blender. And again, that's something that specifically we will go over in the final exercise for Blender when you actually need to get out still images. But that's all we're going to talk about in terms of working with the camera. So again, important things are just knowing how to aim it into your environment, understand which way is up by looking for that, that pyramid arrow on top of your camera. It should always point towards the sky if you want it to be up and down. And working with the properties to make sure you can adjust perspective or orthographic angle of view. All right. So that'll conclude the camera demonstration. So we'll stop this particular video right here, and we'll pick up next. We'll start looking probably at color and texture, so we'll get that rolling in a minute.